Imagine a civil war in your own backyard. That's what happened to the family that lived at this site near Madison, Indiana, shortly after America's Civil War began. General John Hunt Morgan and his band of Southern raiders terrorized the southern Indiana countryside before they were finally captured. In fact, Americans felt so strongly about property rights and the future of the Union that they turned their guns on each other. The South formed the Confederate States of America, and President Abraham Lincoln raised a Northern army to fight against disunion. The Civil War had begun, and the Ohio River Valley was part of it.
People understood the United States to be the beacon of freedom and of liberty and of Republican institutions. Indiana people were not terribly interested in freeing the slaves so much as eliminating the stain of slavery from the country. Slavery was a stain in their minds. Republican institutions should not be supported by the institution of slavery, many thought. People were not interested in racial equality. They did not believe in racial equality. They did not think that the black man should have a role in the life of the country. Many supported colonization efforts to remove African Americans from the country and send them to Africa. So people did not believe in abolition for the well-being of the African Americans who were suffering under slavery. Some did, but most did not. Many who opposed the institution of slavery in this country did so because they thought that slavery was incompatible with Republican form of government.
Madison, Indiana in the mid-1800s was probably the most mixed ideas that you can get anywhere. Across the river in Kentucky, there was people wanting slavery. As soon as you crossed the river, you were into a territory that everybody was supposed to be free. So these two attitudes were butting heads and constantly disagreeing with each other because of how they felt. So that put this area on the cutting edge of what was happening in our nation that was getting ready for the Civil War later on.
The issue of slavery and its expansion into the Western territories was a flashpoint issue. It was a driving issue in the partisan politics of the day. The southern slave states felt threatened by anyone sitting in the White House who was an avowed abolitionist. They believed that Abraham Lincoln was going to destroy their system of subjugation of the slaves and their economic system, and they were going to try to preserve that by seceding. So one could argue that the Civil War was caused by Abraham Lincoln becoming President of the United States. He did not want to be the cause of war, but I think he understood that he was the cause of the war.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. President Abraham Lincoln.
Well, one of the fun stories of Madison is Jesse Bright. Jesse Bright lived here. He was the lieutenant governor here in the state. He also was a United States senator. This was right before and then up to the Civil War. He was a good friend of Jefferson Davis.
He made the decision here even a couple months before the firing on Fort Sumter to write a letter of recommendation for a friend who had invented a firearms improvement. This letter went down to President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy. The letter was actually intercepted, and when people saw that Jesse Bright had written the letter, he was basically accused of treason. Congress pursued this, and as a result of the hearing, Congress basically kicked him out of the Senate.
The incriminating evidence about him was brought by a gentleman here in town, Mr. Michael Garber. And Mr. Garber was the editor of the newspaper. And he's the one that sort of spearheaded Senator Bright's demise.
Well, Jesse Bright and Michael Garber were very, very powerful men. Each had their own beliefs. Bright was very pro-Southern, actually owned slaves down in Kentucky. Michael Garber, who is the publisher and owner of the Madison Courier, had strict abolitionist views, and they basically disagreed on all the issues of the day. And Garber would editorialize in his paper, and he would denounce Bright. Of course, Bright was a famous speech giver, and he would denounce Garber. And at times, it almost like they came to blows. And depending on your attitude and your beliefs in Madison, you tend to decide with one man or the other. But both were so strong, and they really did kind of represent the epitome of the opposing views of the day that ultimately led to the American Civil War.
Jefferson County not only supplied major numbers of troops for the Union cause, Madison also was the home of one of the largest military hospitals in the entire country, Union or Confederate. Once again, there were huge numbers of wounded Union soldiers there from all over the country. Madison would have been extraordinarily well known during the Civil War simply because so many of the wounded troops would have been convalescing here on the edge of town.
You know, obviously we supplied lots of soldiers, but what people don't think about are the economic measures that affect communities during the war. Madison in particular supplied lots of food to the Union armies. We actually had a gunboat manufactured in Madison. We had a saddle tree operation here. In fact, Madison was actually one of the very few places in the country where saddle trees were assembled. Well, Confederate General John Hunt Morgan's 1863 raid really is the main point of Civil War interest in this area, as evidenced by the stone behind me that marks the actual route that Morgan's 2,000 plus Confederate cavalrymen took.
Cavalry Commander John Hunt Morgan was a very dynamic cavalry commander, but was difficult to control for the rebel high command. And he was given orders to scout around in Kentucky. He was not given orders to raid Indiana, to cross the Ohio River into Indiana, but he did.
The weather was intensely warm. The hot July sun burned the earth to powder, and we were breathing superheated dust. The Indiana and Ohio towns seemed to stimulate in men accustomed to impoverished and unpretentious Dixie the propensity to appropriate beyond limit or restraint. I had never before seen anything like this disposition to plunder. Our perilous situation only seemed to render the men more reckless. At the same time, anything more ludicrous than the manner in which they indulged their predatory tastes can scarcely be imagined.
It's said that their column stretched well over 5 miles long. It took an hour for it to pass, and all the time they were basically stealing horses to replenish their tired mounts and getting some of the women folk along in the houses that they passed to bake them biscuits and feed the troops very hurriedly. But of course, keep in mind that the Union cavalry under General Hobson was just a couple hours behind them on the closing in on them quickly, so the raiders were riding very quickly through this area. Well, the effects of Morgan's raid on Jefferson County and Madison were enormous, and of course you can understand there'd be a tremendous amount of panic that would ensue. And actually the local folks did think that they were going to be attacked. In fact, Morgan had plans of attacking Madison in order to get back across the Ohio River. We have a local hero in Madison. His name is Luther Martin, and he was the telegrapher in town, and he knew that telegraphic messages were being intercepted by Morgan's telegrapher, a fellow by the name of Lightning Ellsworth. And so Luther Martin typed out kind of a bogus message that Madison was being heavily defended by gunboats, and lots of Union troops had fortifications and all kinds of pieces of artillery. And Lightning Ellsworth intercepted that message and passed it on to his commander, John Hunt Morgan. Morgan then decided to bypass Madison. He thought it was too heavily defended. And in essence, this Luther Martin kept Madison from being attacked by Morgan during the raid.
So he avoided that conflict there, a potential battle, and rode around Madison and continued on his way north and east, eventually leaving the state on the 13th, July 13th, and entered into Ohio, rode north of Cincinnati, and made his way then along the north bank of the Ohio River, where in late July he was finally captured with the remnants of his command.
It goes without saying that for the 3 weeks they were in Indiana and Ohio, it caused a tremendous amount of excitement to the people. Well, at the start of the war, Indiana was basically just broke at the time, and Governor Oliver Morton was having a hard time finding the resources to equip the newly formed Indiana regiments. Lanier, who had built a marvelous mansion in Madison, but by this time had moved to New York City, was a friend of Morton and volunteered to loan Indiana a considerable sum of money, I think in excess of $1 million when it's all said and done, in order to equip Indiana's troops.
The application was made at the darkest period of the whole war. I could have no security whatever and could rely for reimbursement only on the good faith of a legislature to be chosen at a future and distant day, and upon the chances of it being made up of more upright and patriotic members than those composing the one then in existence. If the great contest should turn out disastrously to the cause of the Union and of freedom, I could never expect to be repaid $1. I felt, however, that on no account must the debt of a great state be discredited, nor the position of its magistrate, and the ablest and most efficient of all the loyal governors be compromised or weakened. No alternative was left me but to advance the sum required. If the credit of the state in such a critical period should be destroyed, that of other states and even of the federal government might be so impaired as to render it impossible for them to sustain the immense burdens of the war.
That allowed the state to equip its troops, which at the time was very, very important to the Union war effort, and Indiana troops were involved in some of the early battles almost earlier than any other state as far as actual contributing to the Union cause.
Freedom was an issue that started from the very beginning of our nation, and many people that came in this area had seen the American Revolutionary War fought, and that was all about freedom. That was the only thing, I mean, we as a country fought and won. So when the black people did not get their freedom like the rest of the white people did, it became a big issue, and there was, of course, our nation divided on having the slaves so they could make money and build up the cotton industry versus, you know, doing the right thing and having everybody be free. So the money was what was causing people to want to have the slavery. And there were many, many people in the North, of course, who said that is just wrong. Religiously, it's wrong. We're not supposed to have slaves. We're not supposed to live that type of life. So because of those two conflicts, we had to end it. I mean, we had to stop that somehow, and it was too bad that it had to end up being a huge civil war, and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men were killed, but it made our country a solid country after that, with no slavery.
You know, during the Civil War, Madison was in a rather unique position. Less than a half a mile away is Kentucky. The community went through a period the same as the South and same as so many other Union cities of, oh my goodness, how many of our sons, our dads, our uncles did we lose? How can we proceed? How will we proceed? And we did proceed, move forward. I think we all had economic problems. It was a time of change for everyone.
Well, the obvious impact to the end of the Civil War, first and foremost, would be the casualties. There were over 600,000 deaths, both Northern and Southern troops. You can probably add another million-plus wounded to those numbers. You can imagine the impact it would have on the communities. Communities like Madison suffered horribly during the Civil War. Economic impacts, obviously both sides saw those. Of course, the South was absolutely devastated. Totally, its economy and industry was just destroyed, and took years for that to come back. Of course, Northern industry, which developed during the war, really kind of came into even more prominence in the late 1800s when the really United States became an industrial giant, and you can attribute that to the Civil War and the increased technology and production that occurred during the war.
As the war came to a close with the Union's victory assured, a conspirator named John Wilkes Booth burst into President Lincoln's box at the Ford Theater and shot him to death. After the loss of 600,000 men, the Union had prevailed, but the future was far from clear. While the country was reunited, the South was destitute, and the economic hardship reached across the Ohio River to Madison. Slavery was obliterated, but the entire nation paid a terrible price for its bitter family fight.